This lecture will offer a short overview about the importance of risk perception in the field of risk management in general and that of disaster risk management in particular. Research in the field of risk perception for decades has gained the attention of academics from various disciplines such as psychology, economics, environmental sciences, and medicine. Nowadays, risk perception is considered an important part of risk management. The question that arises in many studies is whether capital and risk management funds should be allocated based on individuals' perceptions, or we should refer to the recommendations and assessments made by experts in the relevant field. Understanding of risk perceptions or factors that influence risk perception has a direct impact on the financial and social well-being of an individual or even of society. Further understanding how individuals are involved in decisions under risk conditions will help identify mechanisms that can lead towards an effective decision-making process. Identifying individuals who are likely to take risks will improve risk communication by addressing them with tailored messages that emphasize the goals and values that are essential to them. Understanding risk perception for both individuals and decision-makings regulates the focus of society and has a very significant effect on how resources will be distributed throughout society today. As the years go by, the world is increasingly exposed to instability and risks. If we take a look at the daily news, we will be faced with numerous reports of natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, war, terrorism, disease. Over the past half-century, an increased damage to property, infrastructure, and loss of life highlights the need for understanding risk perception of catastrophic hazards in order for individuals, households, communities, and policymakers to better prepare for disasters. Referring to the field of natural disasters, understanding of risk perception can help the decision-making process and the design of efficient national disaster plans and policy that will address the need of the population and their expected reaction to disaster events. The first part of this lecture will offer a short overview about the importance of risk perception in the field of risk management in general and that of disaster risk management in particular. After that, it will be preceded with an introduction to the key paradigms of risk perception to demonstrate the importance of risk perception. Given that environmental issues are closely linked to several natural disasters, particular attention will be paid to the importance and the perception of environmental risks and the heuristics that often guide us in our decision-making process. This lecture will also present a literature review about cultural differences in risk perception. The final part of the lecture will present a case study about disaster risk perception focused on Albanian flood-prone areas. In general terms, perception of risks can be considered as an interpretation or understanding that the individual gives to particular threats that could potentially cause loss of life or property. Risk perception includes the process of collecting, selecting, and interpreting signals about uncertain impacts or events, activities, or technologies. These signals can be referred directly to observations, for example, evidence of a car accident, or information from others, for example, reading about nuclear power in the newspaper. Floods have the largest number of studies conducted in relation to the attitude, perception, information, and preparation of individuals to the risk of natural disasters. Few studies have addressed the risk perception in case of earthquakes and other types of natural disasters. In general, people tend to rate sensational events as posing more risk than less remarkable events, even when the opposite relationship is objectively true. Thus, individuals tend to overestimate the risk of death from terrorism, natural disasters, but underestimate the risk of death from such common causes as heart disease, car accidents, and asthma. This disparity may result in one perceiving rare events as posing more threat to survival than common, but much more frequent natural causes of death or harm. The consequences of these non-objective and distorted risk perception have significant implications. These distorted perception can be transmitted across groups, causing panic and widespread fear of quite unrealistic threats. In general, people tend to rate sensational events as posing more risk than less remarkable events, even when the opposite relationship is objectively true. Thus, individuals tend to overestimate the risk of death from terrorism, natural disasters, but underestimate the risk of death from such common causes as heart disease, car accidents, and asthma. This disparity may result in one perceiving rare events as posing more threat to survival than common, but much more frequent natural causes of death or harm. The consequences of these non-objective and distorted risk perception have significant implications. These distorted perception can be transmitted across groups, causing panic and widespread fear of quite unrealistic threats. Public perceptions and concerns can influence the spending priorities of government more than actual risks identified by experts. Experts in the field of risk assessment make their estimates of actual risks based upon objective information such as frequency data from past events and annual mortality statistics. On the other hand, risk perception incorporates far less objective evidence and relies more exclusively on individuals' emotional intensity or state, his or her history of personal experience, and socio-cultural factors within the community in which the individual resides. These factors influence individual appraisal of risk, consequently leading to biases in risk perception. This is really important because one's worldview and perception of risk are known to be significant drivers of disaster planning. Risk perception research has concentrated on three broad paradigms. In their 1978 paper, How Safe is Safe Enough, Fischhoff, Slovich, Lichtenstein, Red, and Combs used a psychometric analysis to help explain why different technologies and activities might inspire such different risk reaction. The authors take the position that risk can vary across many characteristics. First, how immediately do the effects take place? Or how many people are affected at once? How controllable are the consequences felt? In this expressed preference approach to risk perception, the authors show that perceptions of risk for everyday activities and technologies tend to load on two orthogonal dimensions, which they called dread risk and unknown risk. The psychometric paradigm focuses on individual cognitive characteristics that quantify and predict risk. Specifically, the theory posits that two factors are highly involved in distortion of risk: the dread risk and the unknown risk. Dread risk refers to the catastrophic level of the anticipated hazard, while unknown risk describes the level of perceived controllability and predictability of anticipated hazards. The relationship between these two factors, the catastrophic potential and perceived control of risk, largely determines how severely individuals either exaggerate or minimize their judgment of risks. The higher the level of dread and lack of control with regard to a particular hazard, the greater the sense of perceived risk and the greater the public concern aroused by an anticipated event. These two factors, dread and lack of control, have been remarkably successful in predicting the distortion of risk across a variety of anticipated hazards, and have a direct application to the development of government-supported risk prevention and anti-terrorism programs. The second paradigm was developed in 1988 to explain the process through which a hazardous event leads to direct and indirect societal impacts. The result of this process is an interpretation of the risk, the attribution of meaning to the event, and subsequent societal change. The authors describe the framework as beginning with the actual physical event or the recognition of the event, followed by individuals or groups who identify specific components of the risk to encode and interpret. These interpretations become messages that are communicated to others, who then become amplification stations to further spread or amplify the messages through various communication channels. These amplification stations can include individuals, media, or cultural and political groups. While amplification refers to the process by which a risk is deemed unlikely by analysts, yet goes on to have significant secondary consequences. Attenuation occurs when a risk which is to be considered significant is not given enough societal attention and concern. For example, while driving is far riskier than flying, most people do not approach driving with the same level of fear as they approach the prospect of flying on a commercial airplanes. These attenuated risks are a result of the events themselves and the particular culture where they reside. Cultural theory proposes that individuals choose what they fear in relation to their way of life, that is, in relation to the culture they belong to. To identify different types of culture, Douglas and Waldivsky developed the so-called grid group typology, which suggests 4 prototypical patterns. Each consists of a characteristic behavioral pattern, social relations, accompanied by a justificatory cosmology or cultural bias. The behavioral pattern includes concrete, observable social relations and actions as well as a social structure. Cosmology refers to a cognitive system that includes attitude and values. Grid group analysis treats ideas and values as both reflecting and constituting the experience both of belonging to a social organization and of a social differentiation within the organization. Egalitarians, for example, have high interest and high identification regarding group relations, but they dislike social relations that are shaped by social differences or hierarchic structures. In their view, social relations are open to negotiation. In this way, each type is a combination of both dimensions. Diagonally opposed groups show differences on both dimensions, grid and group, while neighboring groups show similarities in one dimension but differences on the other. For example, individualists have both low sympathy for hierarchic structures and low sympathy for group attachments. Fatalists, as a neighboring category, also have low sympathy for group attachment but a different relation to the grid dimension. They accept externally ascribed social positions and they recognize constraint by others although they do not feel that they are part of any social collective. For each of the four types, cultural theory offers clear hypotheses about modes of risk perception. Persons with hierarchic orientations are assumed to accept risks as long as decisions about those risks are justified by their governmental authorities or experts. They fear risks that threaten the social order, however. Egalitarians are assumed to oppose risks that will inflict irreversible dangers on many people or on future generations. They distrust risks that are forced on them by the decisions of governmental authorities. Fatalists have a strong orientation toward socially assigned classifications, but without a group identification. They try not to know and not to worry about things that they believe they can do nothing about. Individualists perceive risk as opportunity. New technologies, for example, are viewed more as possibilities and less as dangers. They fear risks that could limit their freedom. Description of heuristics in the dictionary refers to the study of how people use their experience to find answers to questions that arise or to improve their skills. It has been argued that people are unable to perceive, receive, and process information. As a result, psychologists claim that such limitations lead to biased judgments, and an example of them is heuristics. Heuristics can be described as a quick way or a shortcut to more efficient judgments that the human mind uses to quickly solve complex problems. Heuristics contain powerful and useful problem-solving tools. However, when used where it's not necessary, it can lead to systematic mental errors. Optical illusions are a simple way of illustrating heuristics. Let's look at an example from the following figure. Which of these two segments is longer? The answer is that the first segment, above, looks longer. In fact, both segments have the same length. Here we notice the effect of an optical illusion. In this case, our minds fall into the trap of thinking that the first line is closer to the eye than it really is. This is due to the visual effect of the arrows. It should be noted that for the optical illusion, as well as for others, even though we are aware of the fact that segments have the same length, we still perceive them as having different lengths. Heuristics that have evolved over the years can be thought of as the central unit of the brain, so the hardware. But unlike programs, heuristics are such an important tool that cannot be reprogrammed. Just an optical illusion illustrating heuristics, when used wrongly, can cause mental errors. In the case of the risk management process, heuristics can make individuals perceive risk with a wrong probability by overestimating or underestimating it. People use different heuristics in problem solving, so this section will focus on some of the heuristics that are closely related to the most common mental errors or errors in judgments made by people referring to environmental risk perception. Availability heuristic indicates that events that are easily perceived by the mind are more likely to occur. For example, our subjective probability of a car accident increases when we see a car crashed on the side of the road. An example referring to the environmental risks provided by one study showed that people were more concerned about global warming on days warmer than usual. The frequency of an event leads people to exaggerate the likelihood of its occurrence. Therefore, media coverage of an accident or of a catastrophic event may affect the perceived probability. The anchoring and adjustment heuristic refers to the fact that when making estimates, people often start out from a reference point that is salient in the situation, that is called the anchor, and then adjust this first estimate to arrive at a final judgment. In most cases, the adjustment is insufficient, and the final estimates are biased toward the anchor. For example, when asked to guess the percentage of African countries in the United Nations, people's estimates were heavily influenced by an arbitrary number that showed up on a wheel of fortune in the participant presence. The average estimate almost doubled from 25% to 45% when the wheel showed a 65 rather than a 10. Optimistic bias is the tendency to perceive oneself as less at risk of negative events than others. When comparing the optimistic bias to actual risk, people tend to accurately rate their own risk but overestimate the risk to others. That is when the optimistic bias is combined with a tendency to overestimate risk from hazard. Self-risk is equivalent to actual risk. For example, people tend to perceive risks of climate change, mobile phones, radioactive waste, and genetically modified food to be smaller for themselves than others. These heuristics can greatly affect the risk management process, as they may fail to take action to prevent a personal risk event. Personal experience with a hazard also diminishes the optimistic bias in predictions for future hazards. This was demonstrated by the author Helweg and Larsen, who found that individuals exposed to an earthquake tend to perceive an equal amount of risk for themselves and others, referring to future earthquakes. A factor that shapes risk evaluations is the framing of a problem. Framing effects refer to the finding that different descriptions of otherwise identical problems can alter people's decisions. Simple changes in wording, such as describing outcomes in terms of losses versus gains, can lead to different preferences. Hardesty in 2010 demonstrated in an experiment how framing influences environmental decisions and how this process is shaped by individual differences, such as political affiliation. Participants were asked to choose one of two airline tickets. The tickets were identical except that the green option was more expensive because it included a carbon fee. This fee was framed either negatively as a tax or positively as an offset. As expected, the green option was chosen more frequently when it was framed as an offset rather than as a tax. This effect was moderated by political affiliation. In particular, when framed as a tax, the preference for the green option declined from Democrats to Independents and to Republicans, reflecting Republicans' dislike of taxes. One common explanation for framing effects is that a loss is subjectively experienced as more devastating that the equivalent gain is gratifying. So it's the loss aversion from Tversky and Kahneman. Public perceptions and concerns can influence the spending priorities of government more than actual risks identified by experts. Experts in the field of risk assessment make their estimates of actual risks based upon objective information, such as frequency data from past events and annual mortality statistics. On the other hand, risk perception incorporates far less objective evidence and relies more exclusively on individuals' emotional intensity or state, his or her history of personal experience, and socio-cultural factors within the community in which the individual resides. These factors influence individual appraisal of risk, consequently leading to biases in risk perception. This is really important because one's worldview and perception of risk are known to be significant drivers of disaster planning. Emotion can also occur as a reaction to perceived risks. When people focus on the consequences of risk, they experience consequence-based emotions. This can be prospective, for example, the fear arising from the anticipation of harm, or retrospective, for example, sadness triggered by an experienced loss. When people focus on moral rightness, they experience ethics-based emotions. These can be directed towards oneself, guilt when taking blame, or towards other people, outrage when blaming others. The author Bohm asked respondents to indicate for a list of environmental risks how intensely they experience these four emotion types in response to the risks. The figure is presented in the following slide. Bohm asked respondents to indicate for a list of environmental risks how intensely they experience these four emotion types in response to the risks. The emotional profiles of the risks are shown in this figure. Ethics-based self-directed emotions, example guilt, are particularly strong for individual behaviors such as car use. Ethic-based other directed emotions, example outrage, are experienced when responsibility can be ascribed more clearly to one agent, example chemical dumps. Species extension triggers mainly prospective, fear, example, and retrospective, sadness, consequence-based emotions. Emotional reaction to natural risks, example earthquakes, are generally weaker than those to risks that are caused by humans. Positive emotions are also important in how people perceive and respond to environmental risks. For example, support for climate change policies has been found to be strongly associated not only with worry but also with hope. Some of the most important sociodemographic factors are age. Armas and Abram conducted a study of earthquake risk perception in Romania and found that age was negatively correlated with ability to predict events and positively associated with the potential impacts on life and personal security. Education. The authors found that education was negatively associated with perceived severity of disaster outcomes in Romania. Religion also. Religious subjects generally perceived greater possible disaster impact and had an overall greater level of concern with potential disasters than did not religious respondents. In summary, several sociodemographic factors plus cultural contexts are expected to play roles in risk perception, but more research is needed in the social aspect of risk perception. Gender is one of the most important demographic variables for research of risk perception. Gustafsson suggested that gender differences may differ among various hazards. For example, males may concern more about health and safety risks, industrial accidents, and physical violence, although females may worry more about environmental risks, infectious disease, and sexual assault. On the other hand, numerous studies have consistently demonstrated that females had higher risk perception than males across various environmental and industrial hazards. Armas studied the risk perception of residents in Bucharest, Romania, which is a high-risk area for earthquakes, and found that compared with males, females had higher risk perception. Furthermore, for the three natural disasters of flood, storm, and earthquake, PLUP found that earthquake was the only one that females' risk rating were higher than those for males. The study conducted by Poiani and Hudra 2018 tried to understand the level of awareness of disaster risk and the factors that affect risk perception. In addition, the link between disaster risk perception and risk communication have been addressed. This case study used both qualitative and quantitative data analysis. 4 flood-prone areas of Albania have been chosen for this purpose: Daic area in the northern Albania, Fier Novosela area in the southern Albania, and Lanas River zone in Tirana, so central Albania. Both observation and semi-structured interviews were used in the process of collecting primary data, and public report review was used to triangulate the findings. With the aim of being closer to the affected population world and better understanding of the behavior and responsive they have given, face-to-face interviews were conducted. A total of 104 interviews were completed. The interview had 68 questions divided in 4 sections. The qualitative and quantitative analysis done in this study produced some very important findings in relation to risk attitude of Albanian population living in the study areas. In this slide, I will present some of the findings of this case study. Families with higher monthly incomes are the ones that are more likely to avoid the risk of natural disasters. Measures such as improving housing conditions to protect against floods, willingness to pay specific flood tax, readiness to leave the risk area, willingness to attend pre-disaster training, saving for emergency situations are some of the examples of disaster risk response of the population. Unmarried respondents are more tolerant of risk, and this is normal because it relates to the fewest responsibilities they have compared to married ones. As the level of education increases, the tolerance of individuals to the risk of natural disaster decreases. This is logical because as much knowledge becomes available, the more the tendency to avoid disasters increases. Age also has the same relation as education with tolerance to natural disasters or hazards. Individuals in the central and southern parts of Albania are more tolerant of the risks of catastrophes. This is mainly related to the economic inability of the Tirana river banks to take measures against floods and the lack of desire of residents in the southern areas to leave the property for decades and their generations. Emotional bonds with property, trust in major forces, the number of previous experiences with floods have definitely influenced the perception they have on natural risks. In summary, as risk perception plays an important role in the human response to natural and man-made disasters, as well as contribute to decision-making for risk management and disaster mitigation, it is imperative to study its internal structure. The development of effective public education in regard to individual, family, and community mitigation and coping could benefit greatly from the research evidence on risk perception. Meanwhile, related public policy making, such as formulation of a national disaster insurance program or implementation of public disaster warning systems and evacuation plans, should be informed by a better understanding of factors related to risk perception. Thank you for your attention. You can pose your questions in the Canvas platform.